sort of putting it straight onto the shirt here. It usually works out pretty well. So if you're comfortable with that, you just have to turn around this way. And then I like sort of above the second part. Is that okay? It's a tight one. Is it turning on? No. I'm sorry. Okay. Wow. Now this should work. Okay.
Yep. All right. Excellent.
Awesome. That should be it.
Yeah.
Thank you. And you know, time-wise, like how much?
So 40, 45 minutes.
It's about 40 minutes.
40
And then we
minutes.
give about 15 minutes for Q&A.
Yeah.
The people come usually in the meetings, which is pretty general.
Yeah.
So yeah, policy,
Yeah.
law.
Good. Fresh high.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it.
Right, good afternoon. How was your spring break? Short, oh, okay. All right, let's get started. Our speaker next week will be Ryford Smith, who is the Vice President for Corporate Development and Planning at CPS Energy, which is based out of San Antonio. Ryford will be speaking to us on Internet of Things, analytics, batteries, and PV, how utilities are transforming into the utility of the future. And as many of you might know, CPS Energy, which is the muni that operates water and electricity in San Antonio, has been at the forefront of a lot of these changes. So it should be a very interesting talk. It's a great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker today, Dr. Nikita Banker, who is the Senior Scientific Engineering Associate at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Nikit and I go back several years ago at Stanford when we overlapped for a few years when he was beginning his PhD program and I was kind of ending my program and was there as a postdoc. Nikit leads the renewable energy research at the International Energy Studies Group at LBL. His research focuses on the technical, economic, and policy aspects of grid integration of renewables, kind of things that we have been talking about at this forum for many semesters now. Nikit regularly advises national government, utilities, and regulators in India and in other countries on clean energy policies and programs. He holds a master's degree in economics and bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from University of Pune and has a PhD in environment and resources from Stanford University. Nikit, it's such a pleasure to have you here. Please join me.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Varun. Thank you, Vivek, for organizing this, and thank you for coming up. So I'm going to talk about the political economy of energy policy in India, and in the context of what it means for taking any kind of climate mitigation or greenhouse gas reduction actions. And the reason I'm going to focus on the greenhouse gas aspect is because India is one of the key kind of greenhouse gas emitters of the world. As we all know, it's US, India, China, and the EU bloc constitute about 75 to 80% of the total greenhouse gas emissions that are responsible for global warming. US, on one hand, has already taken significant actions. China has committed to take actions ahead of the Paris Conference of the Parties that happened in November and December last year. And India, who has also kind of committed to taking some actions, but India is like China's story, about 10 to 15 years behind, in a sense that a massive energy and emissions explosion that we saw in China in 1980s and 90s has not yet happened in India. India is right at the cusp of that kink in the curve of energy consumption and emissions. And that's why what actions India takes in terms of climate mitigation and greenhouse gas reductions are absolutely crucial for other developing countries to follow going forward. So before I go into the talk, let me just quickly introduce Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. So I work at the International Energy Studies Group of Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, or LBNL. So LBNL is a US Department of Energy's national lab. So we are one of the 12 national labs that US DOE created. And we work on a range of energy-related issues, ranging from nuclear physics to biochemistry to some of the applied energy markets where I work on. So we have 13 Nobel laureates at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, mostly in the astrophysics and nuclear physics and biochemistry divisions. And we also have quite a few kind of authors who contributed to the IPCC report that won the Nobel Prize in 2007. All right, so I'm first quickly going to give you a quick overview of the energy sector in India and what are we really talking about. What are the key political economic drivers of the energy sector or energy policy action in India. And then I'm going to kind of talk about 4 specific significant climate mitigation opportunities that we have analyzed in India. One is about the energy demand, that is room AC energy efficiency. And what exactly it means, I'll explain when I go to that section. The second is the renewable energy grid integration. The third is electrification of transport, EVs and so on. And fourth is energy access. And why is that important? I'll come to that later. All right, so quickly, what does it mean to look at the energy picture in India? So this is a slightly old figure, 2009, but the numbers still are more or less the same. So this is the total primary energy supply in India, which is dominated by coal and oil. Coal nearly 56%, oil 31%, so nearly about 90% of India's primary energy is essentially fossil-based, and there is, of course, natural gas. So most of the coal is consumed in the power sector for generating electricity. And even in steel and cement sector that you see here, which is about 11% of coal consumption, it is still about power generation in those industries, and partly some heat generation. So whenever we talk about energy in India, we are largely talking about coal, and also largely talking about electricity that is generated from the coal. Now, out of the total electricity generation in India, this is again a slightly older figure, which is about 750 terawatt hours. The new figure is 1,000 terawatt hours, but the split has not changed much. Coal is about 70% of the total electricity generation. Natural gas about 8 to 10%, and the rest are mostly non-fossils. So this shows how much of coal and oil in India, which is about 85% of India's total primary energy supply, is domestically produced versus how much is imported. So about 15 to 20% of India's coal is imported. But look at oil. For the last 10 years, and actually this line goes flat even 10 years further, since the mid-90s or so, the domestic oil production in India is completely flat. But the oil consumption has been increasing significantly at 6, 7, 8% each year as the incomes in India are increasing, which means that the oil imports are increasing significantly. And this is a 2012 figure, and in 2012, when the oil price was almost at its peak, nearly $120, $130 a barrel, India spent nearly 5 to 6% of its GDP just on importing fossil fuels. This is entire GDP of the state of Gujarat, one of the most industrialized states in the country. Or India's GDP growth rate has been 5 to 6% each year, which implies that each year all the progress that India makes in terms of growing the economy essentially goes outside the country to buy the carbon. And as you see, 50% of India's carbon is essentially imported. All right, so the other kind of issue that is closely linked with the energy sector in India is air quality, and that too outdoor air quality. I'm not talking about indoor air quality because of because there are significant kind of heterogeneities in terms of how the air quality is and what are the sources and so on and so forth. But outdoor air quality is increasingly kind of understood as a major problem in the local environment in India. So New Delhi, for example, is now one of the worst polluted cities in the world. It is actually more polluted than Beijing on a few days of the winter. All the smog that kind of adds up. And my previous colleague, Josh Apte, who's now a faculty here, has done phenomenal work in the air quality in New Delhi and in India in general. And this is actually a chart from one of his work. So thank you, Josh. So air quality is now one of the leading causes of premature deaths in India. And if you look at this number, there are more than 600,000 deaths due to bad air quality in India. And this number, 600,000 deaths per year, premature deaths. And this number is more than the tuberculosis, AIDS, and malaria combined. And most of the public health efforts in India or in all the other multilateral development agencies, WHO or USAID and so on and so forth, have been focused on mostly addressing these diseases. These are important, no doubt about that. But air quality is actually not just an energy or local environment problem, but it's also a public health problem. And it has very, very close linkages with what energy sources are being used. So one of the major contributors to the particulate emissions and bad air quality are, of course, the transport sector, the fuel emissions from the cars and trucks, coal power plants, and where the PM 2.5 particles actually travel several hundreds of kilometers into the Indian cities and pollute the air there, and also the black soot that coal power plants emit from the close-by area. All right. So we talked about the carbon intensity of India's energy mix. We talked about the import dependence of India's energy. We talked about the outdoor air quality and its linkages with the energy. And now the fifth major problem in India's energy sector is completely bankrupt or financially distressed distribution utilities. So most of the distribution utilities in India are publicly owned. Most of them are owned by the state governments or municipal governments and so on. And almost all of them, with a few exceptions of the privately owned utilities, which are only 5 to 10% by total sales, almost all the public utilities are on the verge of bankruptcy. And this chart shows their annual expenditure and their annual revenue. So if you look at this, so this is the 2012 figure, the net loss, even after the government subsidy, is nearly $9 to $10 billion each year. And this is just a loss that is passed on to the public exchequer because these are essentially publicly owned utilities. So this is a major problem and is just a symptom of a lot of other governance-related issues that I will talk about in the Indian electricity sector. But financially distressed utilities is a major problem for two reasons. One is that kind of makes any aggressive clean energy or any aggressive energy action almost impossible, because the first questions utilities ask is, how much is this going to cost? If it costs even a penny more, we are not going to do it because we are already bankrupt. So this is problem number one. And problem number two is this kind of takes away any incentive that private industry may have in actually building new energy supply sources, because their investments are not essentially bankable, because the ultimate consumer of electricity at the wholesale level are these utilities, which are completely bankrupt. So therefore, private sector kind of is unwilling to invest more into the energy supply side. All right. So this is what we essentially talked about. What are the key levers for energy policy action in India? First is the cost, because of the financially bankrupt utilities. Second is the energy security. As we saw, nearly 70 to 80% of oil is imported, and by 2030, 90% of India's oil consumption may be imported if the consumption grows at the same rate, which is a major issue in India. Third is air quality, and in general, local environmental problems, which are gaining more and more attention. And I was just talking with Josh the other day. So we, at LBNL, we have a lot of Indian policymakers visit us, and every time we show them the air quality work that Josh and his colleagues have done, they kind of fight back. No, this cannot be true. Air quality in Delhi is not really that bad. And this time when I was in India, they actually got back to me and said, tell your colleague that he was right, we were wrong, air quality is bad, and we really need to do something about it. So, so one of the kind of important aspects of air quality is that the health damage function due to bad air quality is quite nonlinear. What I mean by that is that it flattens out as the air quality becomes worse and worse, which means that if you really want to have any kind of positive health impact, then you need significant improvement in air quality. Just incremental improvement is not going to help beyond the threshold. The implication of that is air quality improvement has to be multi-sector effort. It cannot be just transportation. It cannot be just stopping biomass burning. It cannot be just stopping brick kilns and so on and so forth. It has to be power sector, biomass sector, transport sector combined, and needs a comprehensive policy action. And fourth, which was not really an energy policy driver per se until a few years ago, is climate mitigation. So India's stance has been, India is an essentially Annex 1 country, so India is not responsible for taking any kind of action for reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. It's a responsibility of the developed world, and we will not do it. However, in the last 2 to 3 years, the stand has radically changed. And one of the kind of indication of that, ahead of the Paris Conference of the Parties last year, India submitted fairly aggressive INDCs. And I wouldn't go into the detail of what INDCs are. Essentially what that means is countries on their own voluntarily say that we will take such and such actions for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And India actually submitted fairly aggressive INDC, independently, nationally determined commitments at the Paris COP. And what those INDC commitments are is reducing India's emissions intensity of the economy by 30 to 35%. So carbon emissions or CO2 emissions per dollar of GDP, reduction in that by 30 to 35% by 2030 relative to 2005 levels, which is a fairly aggressive target. Although not close to the 1.5 or 2 degrees C warming target that we have been talking about, but nonetheless, it's a good first and positive step. So essentially, these 4 levers determine any kind of energy policy action in India. And any fuel choice, any policy choice has to kind of balance these 4 in some way or the other. In this context, there are significant governance problems in the Indian energy sector. Firstly, as I mentioned, most of the power and fossil sector, including the coal mining, oil exploration, and oil production, and power sector, of course, electricity production, distribution, is publicly owned, which kind of creates an opportunity in a way that there is very limited private interest against clean energy. That you see in most of the developed countries, that private sector which has significant exposure to the fossil industry is unwilling to take any action on clean energy and has a significant interest against it. India, it's not the case. That's a significant advantage India has. However, because of the public ownership, economic regulation does not always work. The regulator cannot just say, I'm going to fine you, public utility, and I'm going to give you 2% less return on your equity if you don't do this. Public utility says, no problem. It's not my money. So the economic regulation that typically works with private sector does not work here. And that's why they just don't respond to any regulatory action. The second kind of fallout of the public ownership of the electricity sector and also fossil sector is the prices, energy prices, are highly subsidized. And that kind of leads to the poor financial health of the utility. As we saw, expenditures are significantly higher than the revenue. And this is not to say that the utilities are not inefficient. There is significant inefficiency in the utility. But this is also one of the major problems. And as a result of the poor financial health, there are chronic power and fuel shortages in India for the last 30, 40 years. Albeit with the new administration last year that came into power, things are improving significantly. There is significant kind of coal mining, new coal mining that has been started. What impact it has on the local communities, on the local environment is a separate story, but at least from the energy supply side of things, things have started improving, albeit slowly. Then there are significant constraints on the domestic coal and gas supply in India. First of all, there is no natural gas in India. Most of the natural gas in India is imported. There was a big controversy a few years ago about the largest private corporation in India finding natural gas, but now they are not producing it. So effectively, there is no natural gas in India. All the natural gas is imported. And there are several supply chain constraints on domestic coal. There are not enough rail linkages, there are not enough mining capacity, and so on and so forth. The kind of other important aspect of India's energy sector is most of the infrastructure that will exist in the future is yet to be built, which is in a way an extremely challenging thing to do, but also in a way an excellent opportunity. The reason it's challenging is because if proper actions in terms of climate mitigation are not taken right now, you run the risk of creating significant committed carbon assets. So for example, what has happened with China, is China has built 1,000 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants, which is more than the entire electric generation capacity than in the US. And those coal power plants are now built. They're not going anywhere. So that's a sunk cost. And it's extremely cheap to operate those coal power plants because that cost is already sunk. So that is committed carbon, and India can actually avoid taking that path because most of the supply is yet to be built. And the other aspect of that is that's why the leapfrogging opportunities also exist in India. For example, one can actually make fairly aggressive kind of game-changing vision plans about how the India's energy system could be, and can actually plan on that path. And more than 200 million Indian people lack access to electricity. And this is a phenomenal number because India's total population is 1.2 billion. About 300 million people lacked access to electricity up to about 5 years ago. There have been significant efforts in the last 5 to 7 years, but now still the number is 200 million. That's a mind-boggling number. And given the subsidized tariffs or subsidized energy prices, the utilities have no incentive of reaching out to these poorest of the poor customers. And that's exactly why they just remain unelectrified for the last several decades after India got independence. All right. So this is the context of what we're talking about. Now, in this context, I'm going to talk about these 4 key big climate mitigation opportunities. Let's begin with the air conditioning demand in India, and what are the opportunities for efficiency improvement of air conditioning. So what I mean by room air conditioning is, I'm sure you've seen those small mini-split or window air conditioning units that you install in smaller rooms. In India, they're fairly common in many kind of houses and small commercial establishments. All right, so this chart shows the cooling degree days per year in major cities in the developing world. Well, not necessarily developing world, major cities in the world which are kind of termed as hot. Cooling degree days is essentially just a measure of how much cooling is required per year. So look at Mexico City, Los Angeles, very hot, and the size of the bubble indicates the population of that city. This is Guangzhou in China, Shenzhen, and why these are important in China, I'll come to that in Miami. And look at these Indian metropolises, Chennai, Mumbai, Calcutta, Delhi. So Indian cities are extremely hot and they're populous. What that means is when the incomes rise, there is going to be a surge in the need for air conditioning in these cities and in general in India. And we have seen that in China. And that's exactly why it's extremely important to act on it right now. So this chart shows the number of appliances per 100 urban Chinese households. So essentially, what this means is, say, look at clothes washers. In 1984, there were 60 clothes washers per 100 households in urban China. What I want you to see is the air conditioning, room air conditioners chart. In 1992, there were almost 0 room air conditioners in China, 1992. In 2007 or 2006, there were 100 room air conditioners per 100 urban Chinese households. So this is an addition of roughly 100 to 150 million air conditioners in a span of 15 years. In terms of demand, this is equivalent to adding roughly about 150 to 200 gigawatts of demand. So Texas total demand is roughly about 30 to 40 gigawatts. So this is adding 5 Texas grids in a matter of 15 years. This is immense, and this has happened in China. And the reason it happened is because the incomes rose extremely fast at the same time. Because of the induced innovation in industry and several other innovation kind of explanations, the prices, the air conditioning prices kept dropping. And that's why the air conditioning ownership increased. And this is where India was in 2014, right at this point, just before the kink actually hits. This is for color TVs, for refrigerators, right on the path where China is, or China was, say, 15 to 20 years ago. And this is exactly why it is important to take any kind of mitigation action in India right now than any time later, unless we we get into the problem of committed carbon. So the room AC, on one hand, the incomes are rising. On the other hand, room AC prices have been falling in real terms, and that's why this is a major danger. And how much of a danger and why this is important is because of this. So this is the electricity consumption of one room air conditioner, roughly about 1.2 kilowatts or 1200 watts per one room air conditioner. And this is all other typical appliances that are used in a middle class Indian urban household combined. Refrigerator, TV, tube lights, incandescent bulbs, ceiling fans, all combined is less than 40% of one air conditioner. And that's exactly why this AC story is extremely important, and how much demand it may add over the next 15 to 20 years is about 150 gigawatts, which is 5 Texas grids by 2030. And this is equivalent to roughly about 200 to 300 large coal-fired power plants, 500 megawatt each, in a span of 15 to 20 years. That's a lot of carbon. And so in addition to consuming a lot of electricity, air conditioners pose another challenge, and that challenge is of peak demand. So this chart shows the daily load curve, the electricity load in the two key cities in India, Mumbai and Delhi, for each hour of the day, 1 through 24. And this is the average kind of electrical load for an average typical summer day and a typical winter day. Winter is red, summer is blue. And look at the difference. Both these cities are mostly residential and commercial. So essentially all the nighttime load that you see, this is not industrial load. This is all the residential air conditioning or residential space cooling in general load. And that difference is significant. So which means that the air conditioning demand has already started hitting the system. It has already started creating a lot of problems into the system in terms of very, very narrow peak demand periods, and that kind of reduces the overall system utilization factor, that increases the cost of the system, and in effect increases the rates that the consumers have to pay. And on the other hand, it also kind of requires significant addition to the power plants. Now there are significant opportunities exist for enhancing the energy efficiency of these air conditioners and making the demand go down significantly. So we did those analysis. We kind of looked at what is the right building design so that you need lower number of air conditioners. What is the building material that you should use? What are the key engineering and engineering components that you should use in an air conditioner? You should use efficient compressor, you should use heat exchanger, and so on and so forth. I won't go into the details of that. But the point is, there is significant cost-effective potential exists in reducing the demand for these air conditioners in a completely cost-effective way without anyone having to pay an extra penny. In fact, actually gaining penny by improving the air conditioner efficiency. Now, why doesn't it happen? So the traditional economic literature, if any of you are economic students, argues the standard market failures. Then there are transaction costs, there is bounded rationality, there are split incentives. I won't go into the details of that, but this is the traditional literature that kind of tells us, and which is partially true in case of India also. But in addition, there are two major factors which come into play here. One is a significant regulatory capture. So the body that kind of sets the energy efficiency standards for air conditioners is essentially, could potentially be captured by the domestic air conditioning manufacturers. That is one explanation. And the second explanation is goes back to the utility governance structures. The distribution utility has no incentive to run any kind of efficiency program, because all these air conditioning users are the richest customers of the utilities customers base. So they pay the highest electricity rates to the utilities. They are the utilities paying customer base. So utility does not want to reduce their consumption by encouraging them to do energy efficiency. Utility just wants them to consume more. Now, the traditional regulatory approach to kind of counter this utility problem is something called decoupling of sales and revenue. I won't go into the details, but if you have more questions, I'll be more than happy to answer later. So it's decoupling of sales and revenue, which essentially implies even if utilities sales go down, utility still earns the same revenue. So utility is revenue neutral. So utility has no incentive or disincentive of favoring one customer over the other, over what energy consumption he or she does. But that has limited effect in India because most of the utilities are kind of fighting for the day-to-day cash flow issues because of their poor financial health. So they don't care if they're revenue neutral or not. All they really care is next month whether I'll have enough money to pay my power supplier or not. And that's why these models completely fail in India. All right, so we talked about why AC energy efficiency may fail. Now let's talk about why renewable grid integration, well, it may not fail, but why? What are the challenges in the renewables grid integration? So in terms of renewable energy in India, the resource availability is not really a constraint. So there is a practically infinite solar energy potential. There is large wind energy potential. And then solar costs have been reducing significantly in sync with the global trends in general. So the most recent solar costs in India are roughly about 6 or 7 cents per kilowatt hour. And the most recent costs in the US are roughly about 8 cents per kilowatt hour. So they're fairly in sync with the global trend. However, the wind costs have not changed much over a decade at all. And wind energy prices have been coming down in the US consistently for the last 10 to 15 years. So there are multiple reasons for that. And one of the main kind of reason or hypothesis is the wind industry is in India is a highly concentrated private industry with a very high HHI index, which essentially implies a regulatory capture of sorts again. The private industry has an incentive to keep those prices very high. They just don't want it to go down, and that's why they have kept it very high. Now, one of the problems with that, if wind prices keep kind of at the same level where they are right now, the bankrupt utilities are not going to buy any wind power. So how is India going to achieve any kind of significant renewable energy additions if the distribution utilities, who are the primary customers of that renewable energy, are not going to buy that? That's a basic issue that one needs an answer about. But the good part about solar and wind energy in India is that those profiles are quite complementary to each other. And in some regions and in some states, it has a very good correlation with demand. And what I mean by that, I'll show you in a minute. So in July 2012, so I'm just going to compare the wind generation in California and wind generation in India. So this is California. In July 2012, on each day of the month, this is how wind generation happened statewide. There's this massive variability. One day it was that high, one day it was this low. In general, it kind of dips at the middle of the day when the demand is the highest because of July is the peak of the summer. So massive air conditioning demand in California. So demand is the highest, but wind energy is the lowest. So you can't use wind energy to meet the air conditioning demand in California. Now look at the wind profile in India. This is one of the states in India, Tamil Nadu, the highest wind generating state in India. And the generation profile is exactly opposite to that of California. And let alone the variability, day-to-day variability in wind generation is also significantly lower than that in California. So India's wind is a summer monsoon wind, which essentially peaks in the months of June through August or September. And that's exactly when the electricity demand in India peaks. And it peaks in the afternoon for space cooling and thanks to the room air conditioners. And this is exactly when around 2, 3 p.m. when the demand peaks, wind also peaks. So wind has a very, very favorable profile to meet that demand. Now, wind so we talked about wind and demand. So now let's look at the correlation between wind and solar. So this is the demand in the state of Delhi, or the city of Delhi, so to speak. It's technically a state, but let's call it city of Delhi. This is the average day in the summer as called in India, not the US summer. This is still springtime, right? So summer, monsoon, post-monsoon, and winter. These are the 4 key seasons, and these are the average load curves for each hour of the day in these 4 seasons. And this is the wind curve, as we just saw. Wind actually peaks in the afternoon and has a very, very good profile match with the demand. And let's look at the solar. Solar peaks in the middle of the day, but the interesting fact is that when the wind is fairly low in March through May, solar is the highest. When the wind peaks in monsoon, solar kind of drops down because of the cloud cover and so on and so forth. So there is a fairly good seasonal correlation between wind and solar, very good diurnal correlation between wind and demand. This kind of makes India's renewable energy mix fairly unique than any other country. So we wanted to assess now what happens if what India has committed ahead of the Paris Conference of the Parties is adding 175 gigawatts of renewable electricity by 2022 in the next 6 years. 175. They are currently at 30 gigawatts. They want to expand from 30 to 175. So adding 5 Texas grids just with renewable energy, just powered with renewable energy in a span of 6 years. Is that really feasible or not? Can the Indian grid actually take that or not? And so on and so forth. So I won't go into the details of how we did the analysis. But we did the analysis, and what we found is that, yes, that is technically feasible. India can actually integrate those 175 gigawatts of renewable electricity by 2022. And this is how much it is going to cost. So the cost is in rupees. So this is equivalent to roughly about 6 cents per kilowatt hour. So the average cost of the baseline scenario with heavy coal dominated scenario, the average cost is roughly about 4 rupees per kilowatt hour. And this is the renewable energy, 175 gigawatts renewable energy scenario, where the cost is only about 3%, 2 to 3% higher. So which means that the 175 gigawatts of renewables could be integrated into the Indian grid at fairly moderate cost. I won't talk about why that is the case. I'll be more than happy to talk in the questions and answers session, but the conclusion is integration of renewables is fairly moderate cost in India. Now, the problem, or the flip side of the coin, is that just cost, knowing the cost is not enough. What we really need to know is the value to the grid. So, for example, wind blows and then wind energy is generated, and utility cannot control that. It has to accept wind energy whenever it's generated. So which means that if utility requires energy at night and wind doesn't blow them, then what does the utility do? It still has to build a coal power plant or a natural gas power plant to meet the demand at night, for example. So as you keep on adding more and more wind or solar into the grid, the value of that solar or wind goes down significantly. And there are 2 reasons why the value goes down. Because as you keep on adding wind or solar, that does not necessarily mean that you actually avoid building new coal or natural gas power plants. Because of the reason I just explained, is for solar, when the solar kind of generation dies down by 6 or 7 in the evening, what do you do with the evening demand? You still need a power plant to power your demand in the evening. So by building solar, you don't avoid your investments in coal or natural gas. And so the value kind of keeps dropping. So every megawatt you add into the system, the value keeps dropping. And as you can see, this is the total value of solar keeps dropping as you add more and more gigawatts into the system. The wind value drops as you add more and more gigawatts into the system. So as long as this value is higher than the cost, then utility is happy. If the value is lower than the cost, utility kind of raises his hands and says, this is just not worth paying so much money to me. So now let's look at solar. Solar, the value starts with 4.5 rupees per kilowatt hour, and the current levelized cost of solar, levelized cost of energy is exactly 4.5. So beyond that, it's actually a loss-making proposition for the utility to keep on buying solar electricity. For wind, the value is fairly high for the first few gigawatts, and then it sharply reduces and it kind of keeps dropping. So the current levelized cost of energy for wind is roughly about 3.2 to 3.3 rupees per kilowatt hour, which means that up to 30 to 40 gigawatts, 50 gigawatts, utility is happy buying that wind, but beyond 30 or 40 gigawatts, utility's value is lower than the cost it has to pay for getting that additional wind energy. All right. To summarize, grid integration is technically feasible, but only at moderate incremental cost. It, of course, needs more transmission, needs more efficient power markets, investments in the flexible resources are key, and so on and so forth. But the key problem is that as the RE value or renewable energy value drops, as you keep on adding more and more gigawatts, you cannot be too ambitious unless you handle how to address this valuation question. And unless you know how to increase the value of renewables, you just cannot keep on adding more and more gigawatts of renewable energy given the financial conditions of the utilities in India. So there are two ways to do it. One is, as I mentioned, increase the value by building more transmission, by doing demand response and such. Or the other is just reduce the cost significantly. So there are several kind of options available for reducing the renewable energy cost still. And I'll be more than happy to take questions on that. So this is where most of the new work needs to happen, is either increasing the value, maximizing the value, and minimizing the cost of renewables. All right, so now I'm briefly going to touch upon these two things, exactly 1 or 2 minutes each, on the transport electrification and energy access. So as I mentioned, by 2030, India may actually import 90% of its total oil consumption. So that's why transportation energy is not only the climate mitigation problem, but also an air quality problem, is one of the leading causes of bad air quality, and also an energy security problem. So the solution could be electrifying the transport sector, using EVs or shifting a lot of freight transport that happens through road to railways. So electrifying the transport. And we did some analysis, so what does it really mean by electrifying transport or using electric vehicles in India? So there are kind of three distinguishing factors in India relative to most of the other developed world. One is the driving conditions in India are extremely congested. So there is a lot of braking, there's a lot of acceleration, and this is exactly where electric vehicles have a better kind of a higher advantage relative to the internal combustion engines. So electric vehicles are more beneficial in India than any other country, than any other North American or European country. That's number one. Number two is it can dramatically reduce air pollutant emissions in cities as we talk, and can be a good air quality reduction measure, air quality improvement measure. The third is it can provide valuable services to the grid for integrating renewables by demand response, by acting as a balancing resource, and so on. And given that India has a lot of original equipment manufacturers, they are, for example, Tata or Mahindra and so on, they're really interested in getting a lead in the global electric vehicle market. So they are quite in support of electrifying transport in India. In fact, India has already launched a national electric mobility mission that targets about 6 million electric vehicles in the next 5 years, and so on. So things are moving fairly aggressively, even on the transportation front. And the most important part is because now you're giving the banker utilities a new customer in the form of electric vehicles, which are also some of the rich customers. Utilities are also going to love this. And utilities' financial condition can potentially improve if they get this new rich customer. I think I'm not fully sure if we have enough time, so I'm quickly going to jump to the conclusion, but I'll be happy to talk about the electricity access in the question. So to summarize, there are unique opportunities in India for aggressive action on climate mitigation. So one, because of the large infrastructure still not built, there are leapfrogging opportunities, and there are also significant co-benefits of mitigation actions like air quality improvement, energy security, and utilities financial health. But governance problems in India also create quite a few unique challenges, as we discussed. And that's why the standard utility programs that have worked in Europe, that have worked in the US, may not always work in India because of the key governance and institutional problems. And that's why significant policy innovation is needed, at least in the short and medium run. Most of the technology innovation has already happened in the US, in the European context. What really India needs is the policy innovation on how to apply that technology and deploy it for significant climate mitigation and other co-benefits. Thank you.
You have any questions, just raise your hand. I'll go to students first.
Sure, I can. Yeah, my name is Marco. I used to be in Vernon's group here. I just had a question. So one of your bullet points in there was that you said that gas production or investment in gas was too risky. Given just the high capacity factors, and it was actually really impressive, the curve on the wind, because in California there's a big problem with the duct curve and the ramping requirements and things like that. But it really seems like you could take advantage of those high capacity factors, build a bunch of cheap, fast ramp gas capacity, and then have it run off of that. Why is it that gas wouldn't work?
You're absolutely right.
Obviously, we'd have to import it, but...
You're absolutely right. So gas is the right investment in India. However, there are kind of two key problems. One is the historical context is such that India betted pretty heavily on domestic gas exploration and invested a lot of resources domestically, but to no avail. So India kind of invested in offshore gas and onshore gas, in shale gas and other unconventional gas, and it has kind of burnt its fingers because most of the private investors showed a lot of interest. They took a lot of government subsidy, but there's no outcome at the end. So no utility actually wants to invest in gas power plants, number one. And number two, with imported gas, you're absolutely right. I mean, even if the imported gas is at $10, $12, $15 an MMBTU, it may still work in the end if you're only using it as a balancing resource. But the problem goes back to the utility. Who is going to invest in those power plants? Because India does not have ancillary services market. India does not have a functioning real-time market. It only has a de facto real-time market. So the value of gas resources, essentially, from the renewable integration perspective, is either in the ancillary services market or in the real-time market, not so much in the day-ahead market. You can potentially use gas in the day-ahead market, but not the expensive gas, most of the cheap gas. And that's why they're still too risky.
Is there any thought to capacity?
Sure, capacity markets, but again, the reason capacity markets may have a very high marginal value is from the ancillary services perspective. But if there are no reserves, for example, in India, there are negative reserves, there is shortage. So even gas bidding in the capacity market, I'm not fully sure if utilities would still take that because reliability is still not valued as it is valued here.
I have a question. With the urgency of the air quality problem and going away from non-carbon, what are your views on nuclear? Where does nuclear energy lie in this, solving this problem?
There are significant risks to the nuclear, in my opinion. One is, of course, the cost. Although it's actually, given the cost overruns to the project and the time overruns to the project, the actual delivered cost of nuclear is still much more expensive than other resources, even solar or wind included. And then there are accident risk, there are leakage risks, and so on and so forth. So I, for one, am not, and given the weak regulatory institutions in India, I wouldn't really bet my farm on nuclear power plants in India. Although, having said that, there was a lot of push for nuclear, at least in the last administration in India, But in this administration, you don't see a lot of push on nuclear.
Hi, thanks for your talk today. Access to water and wastewater sanitation systems, I think, particularly in India, gets a lot of publicity, at least here in the United States. I was curious if, I guess, investment in that industry and in that infrastructure is like in competition for investment dollars when it comes to updating the grid or investing in renewables, or are those symbiotic somehow, or yeah, do those compete with each other?
Not really, because most of the investments in, I mean, yes and no. I mean, let me qualify that answer. So from the private investment perspective, no. There is no competition. From the public investment perspective, there may be some. Because almost the entire investment in the sanitation or water systems is public money. So the way budgets are allocated, so there is some competition in that sense. But unfortunately, the sanitation and water investments, those numbers are extremely small relative to how much money is needed for the power sector investment. So I don't see a real competition per se.
Thanks for your talk. On one of your slides, you mentioned that the discussions of grid parity are misleading.
Yes.
I was hoping you could expand on that a bit.
Sure. Thank you. So what I meant by that is people always say that now the solar cost is 7 cents per kilowatt hour and the wholesale electricity price is 6 cents per kilowatt hour or 7 cents per kilowatt hour, which means solar is now grid parity. And that's not entirely true, because cost is one aspect, but value is the other aspect. So you pay $6 or 6 cents or 7 cents per kilowatt hour of solar that gets generated, and actually spend 3 or 4 more cents per kilowatt hour to actually balance the system with that additional solar that comes in. So the real cost of the system is not 6 or 7, but 10 or 11. So that's why the grid parity cost has to be, or grid parity has to be considered not just on the levelized cost of energy, which is typically mostly cited in the popular press, but it should be the levelized cost of energy plus all the balancing and the integration cost. And if you add those up, then for first few gigawatts, the balancing integration cost would be really small. But as we saw in the valuation thing, as solar kind of that middle of the day power generation starts getting higher and higher, in California they call it the duck chart. And then in the middle of the day, you need to reduce your coal and gas-fired generation and at times nuclear generation to their absolute technical minimums, and then quickly fire back up when the solar starts dropping after, say, 4 or 5 p.m. And so that creates a lot of cost on the system. Those are the balancing or the integration costs. And those are never considered in any of the popular debate on renewable energy. And those should be considered. And that's why the grid parity debate is kind of misleading without considering those costs.
Josh Busby, the LBJ School. I had a question for you to push you on the, a couple of times you said that industry concentration worked against climate mitigation, and you used the example of the the air conditioner industry. And I was curious if, if you think about it, if you only have a handful of producers in that space, that if they're willing to move forward, then the entire sector could change. And you've seen that to a certain extent in the refrigeration market with NRDC's work on HFC. So I'm wondering, is there potential here? Why are you seeing industry concentration in this sense through the lens of regulatory capture as opposed to the opportunities for pushing them for greater efficiency?
No, you're absolutely right. So there are significant opportunities, and that you already see in, say, for example, solar sector. So most of the solar investments in India are all private, and they're the ones who are actually driving the cost down solely because of competition. But the problem with the AC industry is that it's an imperfect market for multiple reasons. I wouldn't go into all the details of it, but it is essentially a combination of significantly inefficient processes that they have carried forward over the last few years. and they just do not want to change that. Eventually, it will change, and they will have to change, because about 70% of ACs sold in India are just imported. And that too, the rest 30% market share that the domestic manufacturers have, about half of it, it's still imported. They just brand it at the border, and they just sell it in India as their own product. So eventually they will have to change. But I'm not fully sure we have that time to organically kind of grow that thing.
Look, just a small question. So comparing solar and wind, solar can be locally generated, but when it comes to wind electricity, there will be a lot of transmission losses, right? Like you generate in Tamil Nadu, but you have to consume, the demand is actually in Delhi and Bombay. So what do you suggest?
Sure. So there are kind of two ways to look at it. That's a great question. So this kind of goes back to the distributed resources versus utility scale concentrated resources at one single point. Yes, solar does offer that advantage. However, it also has a lot of limitations, because you cannot always optimize on your resources when you actually site it locally. For example, Mumbai or Delhi may not be the best location in terms of solar irradiance. It may be somewhere in Gujarat or Rajasthan. So you actually compromise on the resource quality when you do it locally. That's number one. And number two is that you talked about transmission losses. Transmission losses may still be fairly manageable, since most of the transmission happens at the high voltage. So it may still be 2 or 3%. I'm not suggesting that's too little, but that's still manageable. But in general, I completely agree with you. Distributed resources are more efficient in general. However, several times than not, they compromise on the resource quality. And that's why that's a problem.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Great talk. I wanted to ask you about the environmental regulations around getting these like permits, for example, for renewable projects, because you mentioned you guys have a lot to install in 6 years, and in the United States, the environmental regulations are really tough to get permits and stuff, and I'm just wondering how that compares to India.
Yes and no. So in a sense that the environmental laws in India are written in such a vague language. It's extremely person dependent on how those laws are interpreted. So far, there have been examples of both extremes. One is just complete kind of ignorance or no kind of heed to any kind of environmental issues, environmental problems, and projects being built. On the other hand, projects are just not built at all, citing environmental problems. However, given the new targets and given how quickly this new administration moves, I do not foresee that as a problem from the investment perspective. However, from the local environmental problems and the social effects of it, I do foresee a major kind of backlash, and we've already started seeing some of those. When from driving investment perspective, I don't foresee that as a problem.
Just two questions. One of them is on your integration of renewables into the grid. So the demand for peak capacity is going to be much higher than before with the addition of renewables and the other charts you're showing on air conditioning. Now the one problem is that the natural ways to do peak balancing are using hydro or gas, and both of them are stalled in India pretty badly.
Yes.
So you're down to coal to be used as peak as a peak load source, which is a very bad source for that. So I'm just wondering if anybody has done any sort of in-depth work on if you scale up coal plants as peak load, additional to their base load functionalities, what sort of losses are we getting in terms of wear and tear, in terms of efficiency? So that's one. Second, related to this is there's a lot of talk of pumped storage and those sorts of solutions. But when we are citing these plants, solar plants or wind plants, is adequate planning being done to see if these sorts of storage approaches, which don't rely on batteries, because we don't know when the battery solution is going to come at grid scale, can be built into this space? And just if I can take the luxury of asking another in a different area, on the utility side, you mentioned the very large gap between the cost and what's being accrued as revenue. Now, one of the issues, the standard solution to that is tariffs should be raised. There's voter malbehavior. Their populist politicians are holding it back. But if you want energy access 24/7 to all people, and you want a tariff that's economically sensible, has anyone done an analysis of what sort of tariffs can be carried by the bottom 30% of the population? What can they actually pay fairly, and they will pay, which is more important, for that basic level of usage? And how does that compare to the tariffs that are being proposed to be changed? Thanks.
Thanks. Great questions. So just answer them in sequence. So first question about the peaking, or managing the peak demand. So there have been studies of cycling coal power plants, especially supercritical or ultra supercritical, which go into the higher temperature range, and essentially using the temperature difference as the room for ramping the coal power output. On average, the impact on efficiency has been found to be roughly about 10 to 15%, which is quite significant, coming to think of it, because coal power plant efficiency in itself is about 33, 34%, and you're talking about 15% of that, so your total efficiency goes down to 27% or 28% and so on. So unfortunately, in India, as you rightly said, that is seriously being considered as an option, and that's why system operators are just absolutely scared of this new renewable energy targets and how they're going to balance the system without gas, without a lot of hydro. They're absolutely scared about it. And there is no easy solution to that unless you actually build those flexible power plants, and that has to be the solution. There is no other solution to that. Your second question about the pump storage. Yes and no. So unfortunately in India, this is also a major governance problem. The way policy is determined, when the energy minister or someone kind of sets a policy, and everyone just has to implement that policy. There are no other questions asked. There is no comprehensive, there is no holistic view, no integrated view that is taken. So no one is looking at these integrated questions, unfortunately. There are independent efforts that are going on what to do with the pump storage or other forms of storage, which are non-battery storage, but no integrated, how that is going to actually help the integration of renewables. There is absolutely no analysis, and that is exactly where our work tries to answer some of those questions. And the third question was about the tariffs and other things. So there have been several kind of plans proposed. So one of the interesting plans is that government essentially wants to subsidize the low energy consumers, essentially poorest of the poor of the society. So government, instead of subsidizing them each year, just subsidizes them once and for all, builds a massive solar plant or builds like multiple solar plants, which are essentially enough to power that section of the society, which is actually not a lot. So if you added the load of all the 200 million unelectrified households so far, that adds to hardly about 10 gigawatts, which is like India is already building 100 gigawatts of coal, 100 gigawatts of solar power plants in the next 6 years. So this is only about 10% additional load we are talking about. And once and for all, government builds that power plant, and then that is enough to power their homes. And then this is utility essentially financially adjusts their tariffs through that power. So there are several plans. Then similarly allocating old coal power plant power, which is really cheap, to such poor customers so that their tariffs are limited, and then allocating most expensive resources to the other customers. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.